Donald Trump could face more than 100 years in prison for falsifying business records. He'll find out shortly before Republicans decide whether he's their man for president. So how could all of this shape the US election? And what does the rest of the world think? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tom Mcrae. Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 charges in his so-called hush money trial. He was found guilty of falsifying records to cover up payments he made to adult film star Stormy Daniels in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. This makes him the first former US president to be convicted of a criminal offence. Trump could face up to 136 years behind bars. His sentencing next month falls just 4 days before the Republican Party's national convention. That's when party members will nominate who they want as their next president. So what is next for Donald Trump, and what might all of this mean for the US presidential election on November the 5th? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Imogen Kimber.
Our Constitution, this is long from...
Prison or presidency, both potentials for Donald J. Trump. The former US president has been convicted of 34 criminal offences of falsifying business records.
Thank you very much.
At the centre of them, a $130,000 payment to adult film star Stormy Daniels, in exchange for her silence over claims she had sex with Trump around the time of the 2016 election. He says he'll challenge the verdict.
So we're going to be appealing this scam. We're going to be appealing it on many different things. He wouldn't allow us to have witnesses. He wouldn't allow us to talk. He wouldn't allow us to do anything. The judge was a tyrant.
And Trump claims the trials are aimed at preventing him being elected president for a second time in November. He's the first former president to be convicted of a crime. Each of the charges could carry a 4-year jail sentence, although imprisonment is considered unlikely. Trump doesn't think any of this will stop him being elected president a second time. And the US Constitution agrees. A convicted or imprisoned felon can still run for office. Critics say Trump's defiance and claims that the trial was politically motivated are a threat to the rule of law and democracy.
The American principle that no one is above the law was reaffirmed. Donald Trump was given every opportunity to defend himself, and it's reckless. It's dangerous. It's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. The justice system should be respected.
The criminal trial is one of 4 that Trump is facing, but it may be the only one to be held before the presidential election in November. The sentencing is due to take place 4 days before the Republican Party formally nominates its presidential candidate. And there are no signs it might ditch a controversial politician and businessman with a large and loyal following. So what Americans are asking is, will his supporters stick by him? And is there enough of them to win him the presidency for a second time?
Thank you.
Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. Christensen is a journalism professor at Stockholm University. His work focuses on the relationship between tech, journalism and political power. He joins us from there. From Sarasota in Florida, we're joined by Ron Filipkowski. He is a former State and Federal Prosecutor and now editor-in-chief of the political news site Meidas-Touch-dot-com. And Greg Swenson's the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. He's also a founding partner at the investment bank Brigg Macadam. He joins us from Sorrento in Italy. Thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Ron, if I can begin with you, please. I mean, this has been called everything from historic to fraudulent, corrupt to a complete sideshow. What did you make of the verdict?
Well, I paid attention to the entire trial, followed the transcripts every single day and the reporting. I thought that the case was extremely strong. And it was very convincing, the evidence that was presented. Donald Trump certainly could have testified in his own defense. He chose not to. He called one witness on his behalf that was basically acting like a mob lawyer, and that witness testimony was a disaster. So I didn't find the verdict especially surprising, based on the fact that I was following what was actually happening in the courtroom. Now, if I had watched news reports or media reports of the trial, maybe I might feel differently. But the fact that I relied on the testimony and the evidence that was presented made it no surprise whatsoever to me.
And I guess that is reflected in the 34 guilty counts that were handed down by the jury. Greg, does this mean that it's lights out for Donald Trump now?
I don't think so. And if you'd asked me that 6 months ago, I was very concerned that the indictments in general would really help Trump in the nomination process, which it clearly did, but then hurt him in the general election. But I think after voters have seen the reporting on the trial or seen any of the direct quotes from the trial, how Judge Juan Marchand behaved and managed the case, and some of the conflicts or obvious conflicts from both the judge and Alvin Bragg, I think people are going to look through this and actually it could even help Trump in the general election. At the very worst, he'll remain flat. Now, we haven't seen any polling numbers yet, but my guess from the fundraising binge that occurred after the verdict, 54 million is the last I heard, and just the reactions, I think even people that don't like Trump are looking at this as selective justice or weaponization of the justice system, whatever you want to call it. It's probably going to help him.
Christian, what do you make of that this could actually help rather than hinder Trump, especially in the hours and in the day or so since the verdict was handed down? We've really seen Trump and his allies talk about the corruption that they allege has surrounded this judge and this trial.
Yeah, I think when you saw the reaction to the last election, the suggestion that there was a corruption of the electoral system, a suggestion that the courts that were making decisions against that argument on a regular basis, 50, 60, 70 cases where it was basically dismissed that there was a corruption at the electoral. I think it'll probably solidify his base in that way. There's a general consensus that the U.S. Judicial system is corrupt, systematically biased against Republicans. What it does with independence, however, is another question. Whether or not U.S. citizens who are on the fence between voting for Biden or Trump actually fall on the side of Trump as a result of this, I don't know. But I do think that the deeper, more existential question is the way in which this verdict and the aftermath of the verdict will be exploited to promote the idea that there's an inherently corrupt and inefficient judicial system, in the same way that the argument was made in relation to the U.S. electoral system. And then the question, I think, for Americans then becomes, if that's the argument being made, what argument is being made to rectify that problem? Has this been a systemic problem? Is it something that's only happening on selective instances? I think this is a very dangerous road to go down when you systematically begin to question really key elements of U.S. society, like judicial system, like the educational system, like the CDC, for example, during COVID. And I see this as part of a much broader pattern of generating mistrust for these institutions.
Ron, if we can just talk about sentencing for a little bit,
Sure.
Because obviously Trump was found guilty on 34 charges. He could face 4 years in prison for each of those. I mean, what are the chances that he will go to prison at all? And how would that actually work? Could he face them consecutively or concurrently?
I think it's very unlikely that Trump goes to prison. Judge Marchand has bent over backwards, to be fair, in this case, despite a lot of the disinformation that Trump and his supporters have put out. Trump violated his gag order, his bond conditions repeatedly over and over again. Marchand did virtually nothing, fined him $1,000 for each violation. He excluded a lot of evidence that Trump wanted to present. He shrugged off attacks on his family and himself personally. And so at sentencing, this is now the same judge that has to decide whether Trump is going to go to jail, go to prison, or get put on probation. So it could be a combination of those things. I think prison is unlikely, but the question is, would he be sentenced to county jail time, 6 months, 30 days? Certainly he will get probation. That's a given. So I think that's most likely what he's probably going to get.
Sorry, what does probation mean in terms for people outside the United States that might not understand exactly what that entails?
Probation means you have to typically check in once a month with a probation officer who monitors your activity. There could be some restrictions on your travel, although most likely, again, he will be bent over backwards and accommodated once again because he's a politician running for office, and he will be given special exceptions that other people on probation don't have. He could be randomly drug tested. He could be ordered to perform community service. All of those things. But typically to get a break like probation after you're convicted at trial, you have to show remorse. You have to apologize. You have to behave yourself. Clearly, Donald Trump is not going to do any of those things. So most likely, if he gets that kind of sentence, he's going to get the benefit of leniency, despite the fact that he doesn't do anything a normal criminal defendant would do to deserve that.
Yeah, I think Trump has said since being found guilty, he's called the judge a tyrant. Obviously, as you mentioned, that's the same judge that is going to sentence him. Greg, I mean, Trump is really coming in as defiant and fiery as ever, and I can see you smiling and nodding along there. I mean, it's obviously worked extremely well for him in the past. Do you expect him to continue with that policy?
I do. And sometimes I'm very critical of it. I thought the press conference yesterday was too long and it was meandering at times. And he does that well at rallies, but that wasn't really the forum for to communicate that way. And so, yeah, he's running that risk of annoying the judge. And, the sentence is coming on July 11th. That's only 4 days before the Republican National Convention. So I'm always a little bit worried about his unfiltered rhetoric. But on the other hand, it really works for him. And so, when I supported Ron DeSantis in the primary process, I was not, a MAGA big Trump supporter, but now that it's a binary choice, and I realize what's been done with weaponizing the justice system or selective justice, like many, I'm sympathetic to what he's gone through, and I think that as your guest said earlier, I'm also worried about what it's done to the justice system in general, and the sort of distrust or mistrust in it.
Yeah, Christian, just on that point, Trump has come out and accused Biden of pulling the strings behind the scenes here. What do you think that does to undermine the justice system in America?
I think it does a great deal of damage. And I think that, you could be critical of the U.S. justice system. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a citizen of questioning organizations and systems of power. I mean, that's really what being a citizen is all about, is asking questions. And let's remember that for years, many American citizens have been critical of the U.S. justice system in its treatment, for example, of African Americans or minorities. But when that argument was made, we were told on a regular basis that the United States was a country of laws, that we had jury systems, that we needed to trust the legal system. But then when a decision goes against a candidate, suddenly we are in the middle of an extremely corrupt, extremely politicized legal system. And I think that's where the problem really begins, which is it's a selective outrage. Trump is critical of the system in much the same way that we were critical of the electoral system again in 2020, but I didn't hear a great deal of criticism of the electoral system in 2016 when he won. So either we believe the argument that in 4 years, we went from an extremely efficient electoral system to one that was completely broken, and from an extremely efficient, proper legal system to one that's been highly politicized. So I think that is the problem there, that you have these very conflicting arguments, and ordinary citizens who are not educated on the legal system, or maybe not that familiar with the political system even, are left with a kind of a vacuum, and which they have to fill with certain kinds of information. And that vacuum leads to distrust, and that distrust can lead to things like, for example, questioning the authority of the legal system. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it's a problem when it's left completely wide open for citizens to make up their mind with almost no information or with disinformation.
Yeah, and this justice system isn't exactly over for Trump at this point in time. He's signalled that he's going to appeal on a couple of counts. Ron, he said that basically that the judge was conflicted, and he argued that he wanted a venue change, which was denied, that he wouldn't be able to get a fair trial in Manhattan. I mean, what are the chances he's actually going to be successful here on appeal, and how long does that process take?
Well, first of all, appeals on those grounds, the various conspiracy theories that Biden is behind this prosecution, of which there's no evidence and no evidence been presented that Biden or the Biden campaign has anything to do with this whatsoever. The only thing that they point to is the fact that one of the prosecutors on the team, who didn't even do most of the trial, Michael Colangelo, worked in the Justice Department. But it's not unusual for federal prosecutors to go work for the state and vice versa. So that's basically the basis of the conspiracy. And in fact, Michael Colangelo was brought into the Manhattan DA's office to head up the white collar unit and to do housing law. He does a whole bunch of things. He wasn't just brought in to prosecute Trump, which is the conspiracy. So that part of his appeal will not work. The main issue for his appeal is how this law was applied, some of the vagaries of the law. He has a legitimate appeal. The problem for him is that's not going to be resolved until after the election.
Yeah. Greg, I just want to take a step back now and just think about how consequential this verdict actually might be when it comes to the election in November, because Trump's legal problems aren't exactly new. And we do know, Greg, that his base really is baked in, isn't it? Is this going to make any difference whatsoever to the outcome in November?
I think it could. It surely won't with the base, that's for sure. But I think it could if a certain percentage of Republicans will not vote for him with the conviction. And that was some of the polling that was coming out several months ago. But I think things have changed since then. And then you see the people that aren't necessarily supporters of Trump coming out and saying how absurd this trial and the indictment were. And, you saw President Trump reference Andy McCarthy from the National Review yesterday, at least once, maybe twice in his speech. Andy McCarthy is not a Trump supporter. He's not going to vote for him. He never has, even though he's a Republican. Alan Dershowitz, who's a Democrat, will never vote for Trump, hasn't voted for Trump. And he's, basically said, of course, the jury convicted him because they were essentially, told or to convict by the judge. Now, again, that's just Alan Dershowitz's opinion. I'm not validating that, but I think but there is some concern, and I'm glad we're talking about it with this, about election interference or going back to 2020, and yes, it's partisan. Whoever loses complains that the election was illegitimate, which is what Hillary Clinton said after she lost in 2016, and of course you had Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who said that she won the election. She said that for 4 years before losing by 9 points to the sitting governor of Georgia. So it's not healthy. It didn't work, by the way, in 2022 in the midterms. Most of the election deniers or the people obsessed with 2020 did not do well or lost in their elections, even though they won their primaries. And so I don't think it's a winning strategy, but I think in this case, this is a little different because you have so many people, Megyn Kelly, for example, who are not Trump fans or Trump supporters, who are actually now saying, I'm going to vote for Trump.
Yeah, and what we've seen, I think you mentioned this earlier. I mean, his fundraising efforts have gone through the roof since the verdict was handed down. Well over $50 million has come into his campaign. Christian, what does that tell you about his support? And what do you think it says about Trump supporters, that they're actually willing to dismiss the justice system completely at this point in time because, they didn't get the verdict that they thought Trump should deserve?
Well, I think it speaks to a victim of a culture of victimhood a little bit here, that this is sort of a witch hunt against Trump and the Republican Party, which is precisely an argument that the Republicans and Trump have been pushing for quite some time. And not just within the legal system, of course. We're talking about the same thing in terms of media coverage or at education, at universities, whatever it might be. It's the sort of us versus the world mentality, which is pretty interesting because, you're talking about a lot of people with a lot of power talking about the fact that they may have been canceled. I think the fact that he raised that much money in such a short amount of time speaks to a fairly substantial percentage of the U.S. population that believes that this is the case. And this gets back to the issue that I mentioned before, that how dangerous it is, I think, to push this notion that you have these kind of structures, like, for example, that the jury was instructed, that people saying stuff like that. And I don't necessarily think that Megyn Kelly, who worked for Fox News, or Alan Dershowitz are necessarily representative of all that borderline people. You have a fairly substantial component of people in the United States who are actually in the middle, independents, and how they're going to vote, we actually have absolutely no idea. But I think that the amount of money that he raised speaks to, probably, I would say, for non-American audiences, it speaks to a much larger base of Trump supporters who really do believe that these institutions in society are structurally discriminating against Republicans and structurally discriminating against Trump. And underestimating the power of that group as we saw when Trump won the first time, can be a big mistake. And I think we have to be aware of that fact that the support may be bigger than we actually think.
Yeah, obviously on the other side of this is Joe Biden, who's obviously looking to be re-elected for the Democrats as president. Now, we've seen him come out and talk about the justice system being the bedrock of America's democracy and the Constitution. Ron, is that the best way for him to frame this? And what more does he need to do to try and capitalise on this guilty verdict?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about that in a second. But first, let me clear up this Trump raised $15 million, okay? Because that is being argued as the harbinger or an indicator of how much the American public is supposedly rising up and upset about this verdict. First of all, those are numbers that were said by Donald Trump last night. There is no proof whatsoever of how much he raised. This is just Donald Trump claiming that he raised this much. Okay, we report campaign finance reports quarterly. This is a man who is just recently convicted of inflating his assets and his finances. This man has done this his whole life. So we'll see when the campaign finance reports come out how much he actually raised.
Yeah. He does have to disclose this in a couple of months' time.
To inflate that number.
That's right.
He does have to disclaim how much he fundraised, but that doesn't come out for a number of months, though, doesn't it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But so by then, is anybody even going to remember?
Yeah, Greg, do you want to jump in there?
I saw the numbers. Yeah, I saw the numbers from WinRed, and I doubt WinRed, which is the technical firm that assists in fundraising. I doubt they would exaggerate those numbers because it'll come back to haunt them if they are. I'm not saying it's 100% federal election reporting that will come in July, but I would be surprised if they exaggerated like that.
Yeah, Ron, if you can just answer the question about Biden and how he should try and frame this to benefit his campaign.
Well, Joe Biden's son is right now being prosecuted and about to go to trial for felony charges that almost nobody gets prosecuted for in the United States. So the idea that, the Justice Department is weaponized in Joe Biden's favor is a bit absurd when his own son is being prosecuted right now, as well as a Democratic senator from New Jersey is currently in trial right now for fraud charges as well. So I think Joe Biden is very smart to come out and say, look, I haven't put my thumb on the scale here. Democrats are currently being prosecuted. Republicans are being prosecuted. And you don't get immunity for your crimes just because you decided to run for president.
Right. Greg, we talked a little bit about this, how this election is going to come down to a small number of swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, an even smaller number within those states that will probably decide the outcome of this election. Are those people paying any attention to this trial? Does this swing the needle one way or another in terms of who they will vote for come November?
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how the polling comes out this week. And we don't have any data yet. Again, it's just my gut from what I'm reading over the last couple of days that could potentially help President Trump. But there's no doubt this is going to be a very close election. Even if Trump sweeps the southern swing states, Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, he still has to win one of the three Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Biden won all three of those states in 2020. Trump won them in 2016, but they're polling basically dead even right now. Trump might have a half a point or a 1 point lead. That's well within the margin of error. So yeah, it's not going to take much. A 1 or 2 point swing from this verdict, for or against, could swing the election. And I think we have to keep an eye on those states. Biden has to win all three. Trump only has to win one. But again, it's not inconceivable for Biden to pick up a few points and win those three states.
Yeah, indeed. Christian, you're obviously in Stockholm. Can you just give us an idea of the view from Europe at this point in time? I mean, does this whole issue, the lengthy legal process and then the response to it, the calls for corruption, the judge is a tyrant, those sorts of things, how does that undermine America's claim of, world supremacy here? I mean, does it feel like it's being eroded from within?
Well, I don't want to be so presumptuous as to speak for all of Europe, but I grew up in the UK and I lived in Sweden for 15 years as an American. I think that Now, one of the things that shocked people actually in Sweden when I first told them was when Trump was convicted or found guilty, that I told them that doesn't stop him from running for president. I think that that's one thing that people, when they think about the U.S. justice system, they think of imprisonment. We have a very large prison population. That not only can you run for president if you're convicted of crime, but we've actually had two presidential candidates who run for president from prison. I mean, Eugene Debs in 1920 and Lyndon LaRouche in 1992. I do think that the last 6 to 8 years in the United States has actually eroded this sense. And I think that maybe not just in Europe, but I would also say internationally as well. You have to remember that the United States quite often takes the moral high ground on issues of freedom of speech, democracy, elections. Trump has used derogatory terms to refer to countries in, for example, Africa and the state of their democracy. And when you make those kinds of comments as representatives of a government or a country, and you then see presidential candidates who have been convicted of crimes, have been found liable for example, sexual assault in a civil court, running for office, whatever you think of the verdict or whatever your opinion about the legal system, it becomes rather difficult then to take, as I said, the moral high ground on legal issues or ethical issues or political issues internationally. And I think so probably the damage is done there. It's that the United States is latitude for making these kinds of comments becomes extremely narrow when these kinds of things happen. And you could also, as a final point, just throw in here that these are things that have sort of come out in the open. As I pointed out earlier, let's also remember that criticism of the U.S. justice system has been made from other elements of U.S. society, minorities, poor people, for decades, and largely dismissed as being some kind of leftist argument or propaganda against the U.S. legal system. And now we're hearing that it's a completely broken and corrupt system because someone from another area of town has been convicted. And that kind of double standard is very, very hard to ignore. It's quite glaring, actually.
Obviously, a lot of things to happen before the election on November the 5th. We've got the debate later in June. Then there's obviously the Republican Democrat conventions as well as sentencing. And so there's plenty of water to go under the bridge before we get to November. Thank you all very much. Christian, Ron and Greg, we really do appreciate your time and your insight into this. Thanks so much. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Tom Mcrae, and the whole team here. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.